Good evening there, sweet peas. Basic Prepper Mom Myra with just a few little tips and hints here. So when we talk about stocking up and storing up and doing all of that stuff, one of the things that you need to consider are your animals. And I've talked about this before, but you really need to get a game plan. The whole Tractor Supply issue with the chicken feed and them, producing some sort of chicken feed, or the manufacturer that's basically causing your chickens not to lay eggs, whatever the situation. That actually had me less concerned than the fact that there might not be any feed to purchase for your animals. So how do you go about feeding your animals when there is no feed to feed them? Well, now is the time to definitely start looking at that. There are quite a few other channels that touch base on this, homesteading type channels here on YouTube. You can even look it up. One of the things that I saw today that I thought was quite interesting was going to the dollar store and getting a splatter screen, one of the splatter screens like you put over your pan for like bacon and grease and stuff. And they bought some beans there because they're very cheap. So like pinto beans, kidney beans, garbanzo beans, whatever beans, lentils that are there, the dry beans. And they took that mason jar, they put the beans in the mason jar, they filled it up with water, they cut circles out of that screen, and they put a screen over the top of the jar, and then put the jar lid on, and they let it set for, I think, 24 hours. They dumped the water out, rinsed it out a couple of times, and then let it set. And by doing that, the beans and the lentils started to sprout. Well, in about 4 or 5 days, they had sprouts on them. They would take those beans, dump them out in a bowl, and then whatever kitchen scraps or dinner or breakfast scraps that they had, they would also dump that in the bowl, and that's what they would feed to the chickens. So definitely one of those things, when we talk about stocking up, and one of the main stockholds of preparedness type people are rice and beans, right? Rice and beans. You can use them in everything. Beans are great for protein. Rice is a good carbohydrate. It's a starch. It's also a good filler. We've talked about that. So stocking up on rice and beans is very, very important. But this just puts another perspective on how important it is to stock up, because you can also feed chickens rice as well. Don't feed it to them raw. It obviously has to be cooked, but it's very inexpensive. It can be a filler for them. And if you mix that with beans that are sprouted, you've got a really good feed. Now, if they're foraging, that's less that you have to feed. Ideally, you would like your chickens to forage, but if they're in an enclosed area that they can't really forage a lot, or they're in a smaller area to where there's not as much foraging, that's where you need to go ahead and supplement their feedings. But by feeding them scraps, by feeding them things that you already have, and looking at a little bit different creative way to feed, then you can eliminate the need for buying feed at the feed store. So that's just the chicken aspect, or I should say the poultry aspect of that. Depending on, then obviously when you get into larger animals, it gets a little bit more difficult. Pigs are pretty easy. Pigs, you can feed them scraps as well. You can kind of do the same thing with them, feed them some rice and beans, and I mean, they're going to eat it, right? If you're in a bind, you're going to eat it. Obviously, make sure they're cooked, not raw. Where you get into a little bit more difficult situation is with your larger livestock, like your cows, your goats, and your horses. I definitely have not figured out how to combat that, because we don't have pasture. So if you have a pasture, then obviously that's fine. You have fixed that problem, they can be on pasture. But if you are in my neck of the woods, where we have pastures about 2 months out of the year, and then everything dries up and is dead and gone, there's a few pastures around, but they're few and far between, and people are very fortunate if they have them. But if you don't have pastures, and then that's where it gets a little bit tricky. Then you can start looking at things like fodder and fodder systems. And I have tried no, actually I didn't try the fodder system. I did something else. But fodder is one of those things that you can look into. And I don't know how sustainable it is, because you have to have the seed to sprout the fodder. I'm not an expert on it. I like the word expert. I'm not knowledgeable on it. Whew, man, my brain's working faster than my mouth again. I'm not very knowledgeable on it, but fodder can be one of those situations where it might be the only option for large animals. So, but definitely want to look at other avenues. When you're looking at your dogs and cats and things like that, there are definitely other ways to, sorry, my dogs are running out in front of me. Definitely other ways to feed. We are looking into, when you butcher out an animal, you can keep the organ meat, cook the organ meat up, put it in the freezer. You can also freeze dry it and reconstitute it later for long-term storage. We're actually looking at doing that as well. And like I said, nobody in the family, nobody in the family eats organ meat, but organ meat can be a really great thing to save for your canine and even your feline friends. And if they're hungry enough, I bet they'll eat it. So definitely now is the time to be looking at alternative food sources. And here's the most important part of this whole thing. If you start to feed alternative sources, or if you think that that's the way you want to go, now is also the time to transition. Start training your animals on alternative feeding methods. That way, if we do end up in an emergency situation and you throw something at them that they've never ate before, they're not going to freak out and go, well, I'm not going to eat this. If you start introducing it now, then they will be more likely to eat it in an event of an emergency where that's the only thing that they have to eat. And that way you can also see, do they eat this? Do they not eat that? Don't waste your time, effort, and money on things that they are not going to eat. So look at those alternative feeding sources for your animals now. Start putting them into place, start implementing them, find out what works, and stock up on that. All right. Once again, if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to reach out. I hope you guys have a wonderful, amazing day, and we'll talk to you soon.